we're nearing the end of our summer series. So we are on our Thursday forms. I kind of like the Thursday forms, though. I may continue on with Thursday forms even into the new schedule, because I kind of like that we focus one day a week on forms. So we'll probably continue that. I do have the chat box up, so you're welcome to throw any questions that you might have into the chat box. Hi, Adriana. I didn't even notice you joined. And hi. I do have your thing up, so like I could see Adriana unmuted herself to say good morning.
Morning.
And or you could just unmute yourself and interrupt me. Everything's completely appropriate and fair game. Today we are covering the seller counter offer, the seller multiple counter offer, and the buyer counter offer. So your SCO, your SMCO, and your BCO. So remember, when we make an offer on a property and we submit our residential purchase agreement, our RPA, the buyer is making an offer to the seller, and the seller has the option to either accept it, reject it, or to counter that offer. And if the seller chooses to counter the offer, the seller is now turned the tables and is now making an offer to the buyer. Okay, so that's how that works. So originally the buyer's making an offer to the seller, and then the seller turns around and makes a counter offer, and now it becomes a offer to the buyer, which means that the buyer, as long as it's on this first form that we're covering, the seller counter offer, if the buyer agrees to the terms on the counter offer, they sign it, we electronically send it back, we are officially legally in contract on that property. The sellers can't turn around and negotiate with somebody else or decide to go with somebody else's offer. So we have our seller counter offer form. You're going to put whatever seller counter offer number is in here. Usually it starts with number 1, right? We have the residential purchase agreement and then the seller counter offer number 1. You're going to put a date up here in the corner, in the upper right-hand corner, the date prepared. And then this is the counter offer to the purchase agreement. If it was going to go with seller counter offer number 2, right? So buyer makes an offer, seller makes a counter offer, buyer counters the seller counter offer, and now seller is going to counter again. You're just going to go hide in the corner and cry, but that would be the counter offer number 2. So these get numbered sequentially for the seller counter offer. So seller counter offer is 1, buyer counter offer is also going to be 1, because it's going to be the buyer counter offer number 1. And then the second seller counter offer would be seller counter offer number 2. So that's how you do the numbering on those. You're going to reference whether it was the purchase agreement or a buyer counter offer. Keep in mind too that if it's the buyer counter offer that you're responding to, you're going to put the number of the buyer counter offer there. So whether it's buyer counter offer number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, usually you don't get past buyer counter offer number 1, or another document. For the most part, the seller counter offer number 1 should be in reference to a purchase agreement. And then you're going to put the date on the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the purchase agreement. So for this example, we're going to say if the offer was made yesterday. Make sure you've got the full address in there. I know I mention this all the time, but make sure it's got the suffix of the street, right? So it's 123 Sample Street, Court, Drive, Circle, Road, whatever it might be. Make sure that's on there in case there are 123 Sample Street and 123 Sample Court. We need to identify which house we're talking about. Make sure you put the buyer's names in there. It's got places for 2 buyers' names and 2 sellers' names. If you have more than 1 or 2 buyers or sellers, Maciel is getting acquainted with this. I think Anastasia is as well. That there is an ASA form, an additional signature addendum form that you would utilize for buyers or sellers where you have 3, 4, or 5 people as part of that transaction. Buyer and seller are referred to as parties. Yes, Maciel.
I was going to say, man, that really stinks when you have more than 2, because for every single thing that you need to respond to, you need to do an ASA form.
You do.
Yeah. Okay.
That's when you get really good at just sending things out in clumps. Once you get into contract, we don't send anything else out for signatures until we've got it all ready to go.
Is it when you have two people doing an offer on the same property?
No, if
Or-
you've got two buyers, if you've got three buyers making an offer as one unit,
Okay.
that's where that would come into play. So you've got like three buyers or three sellers. I once had like 5 sellers on a property. That was really fun. Terms. The terms and conditions of the above reference document are acceptable and subject to the following, right? So what it's saying here is the terms and conditions of the residential purchase agreement are accepted subject to the following, right? Liquidated damages and arbitration dispute paragraphs and the offer each require initial by all parties. If either of those paragraphs is not initialed by all parties, the paragraph is excluded from the final agreement unless specifically referenced for inclusion in paragraph 1D of this or another counter offer or an addendum. Unless otherwise agreed to, Marcel, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yep.
So on a buyer counter offer, or yeah, our buyer counter offer, we sent it in. Well, anyways, sorry, our RP and everything had 3 people. When the agent did a counter offer to us, she had only put 2 of the people's names because she probably didn't realize that there was an ASA. So would we then have to draft up an addendum because she didn't include it, or like would she have to draft it up because she didn't add the 3rd person, or how does that work?
Nope. So on the seller counter offer, when the seller makes the counter offer, just the 2 buyers are going to be listed here. And then if your buyers accept the counter offer, you would include that ASA form referencing the SCO with the name of the 3rd buyer on there. So the only time you're ever going to see the name of the 3rd buyer is on that ASA form. It will never show up on any of the other documents. And it's your responsibility to include it and list out any of the documents that they are signing for receipt of.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counter offer, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as the original offer, but the dollar amount of any initial and increased deposit and seller credits shall remain unchanged from the original offer, right? So, hey, if we're made an offer at 500 with a deposit of 5,000 and we're putting 10% down, sellers counter us at 525. The loan amount and the down payment, it's still 10%. It's not still the loan amount stays at 500 or at 450. And with that 10% down, it's adjust accordingly. However, that $5,000 deposit stays the same unless it's countered. Okay. So that's just outlining how that works. Unless otherwise agreed, or altered in another counter offer, if in the original offer, such as paragraph 3L2, the RPA, the appraisal contingency amount is lower than the original offered price, then the dollar amount of any difference, the appraisal gap, shall remain unchanged and be deducted from the final contract price to create the final appraisal contingency amount. For example, if the purchase price on the offer is $1 million and the buyer reduces the appraisal contingency value to $950,000, the appraisal gap is $50,000. If the purchase price is increased to 1.2 as a result of the counter offer, the appraisal contingency value should be adjusted to 1.15, 1.2 less 50,000. If the property appraises below 1.15, buyer may exercise the appraisal contingency right to cancel this agreement. Okay, so so we're identifying there that on that 3L2 where we have, the appraisal contingency, and then you have the spot where you can fill in. Let me pull it up so that we can all see it, because we want to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about. Residential listing. Transfer disclosure, it's somewhere in here. I probably already skipped it. I feel like it should have been at the top. Mark it. There we go. Oh, I have to drag it. Hold on here. It's really angry at me right now. There you go. They were just waiting, spinning wheel of death. All right, so we've got our residential purchase agreement, which is loading. My computer's so slow when I'm sharing on Zoom. I was like, what is this platform that I'm on currently? All right, so what it's talking about is down here on this appraisal contingency, right? We have a 17-day appraisal contingency, and it says appraisal contingency based on the appraised value of a minimum purchase price or blank, right? Most of the time we leave that alone unless we're trying to be super competitive. And then like the example said, if we were offering $1 million, we may say, hey, as long as it appraises for 950,000, we're okay. So if we put a number on here, whatever the gap is between this number and the original purchase price, that gap remains the same no matter what the counter offer is. So we don't have to counter on that gap. It's outlining that that same dollar amount difference moves forward with any counter offers price adjustments. Okay. So that's what that paragraph is outlining. So we don't have to counter on that. D is other terms. So here is where we outline whatever items the seller wants to counter on: price, contingency time periods, when the deposit's due, that it's going to be, contingent on the seller finding a replacement property, whatever those items might be that weren't addressed in the original offer. Maybe they asked for the fridge. You don't want to include the fridge. We're going to put that on D, other terms. When I do a counter offer, I like to itemize it because it just makes it easier that if the buyer's going to counter back, and it makes it easier also to identify how many items we're countering on so that nothing gets missed. So, right. So I'd be like, one, purchase price to be 550,000. And I like to put the numerical number in as well as spell it out: 550,000. Oops. Right, in parentheses. And then I would go down the next line, all contingencies. And then you might put like RPA. That's the other thing that I like to do. I like to reference back to the residential purchase agreement. So it might be like L2, it would actually be 3L2 through 3L8 to be 14 days, right? So whatever we're going to do, you might want to also go back and find the purchase price line, and purchase price, it'd be 3, I don't even know what it is, A1, I don't know what or 3A, I don't know what the purchase price line is, but I like to reference it in there. RPA 3A, so that my counter offer coincides with whatever section of the RPA that address that, so that there's never any confusion. So just so you guys know, that's how I really like to draw up my counter offers. Maybe we put like fridge will not convey, and then you'd reference, RPA section 3. I don't even know what that is. M1, where the things are conveyed and not conveyed. Don't pay attention to those paragraph numbers because they're not accurate. I'd actually go back to the residential purchase agreement and look and reference those items where those things are addressed. If we run over and we use too much space here, it's okay. What'll happen is that it's going to kick this to a text overflow addendum automatically. So when I go to actually send this into signatures, it'll automatically include that text overflow addendum to handle the overage of these lines. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, ma'am. Keep typing and it will come out perfect in the end.
It'll come out perfect in the end. And if you click on it again, it will show you all your stuff. So all the stuff shows up in that box, but it will go. If you're like, oh my gosh, 5's gone. No, it's not gone. It'll come back later. Okay. So that's how you fill out section D. E is the following attached documents are incorporated with the seller counter offer when signed and delivered by both parties. If both parties do not sign and deliver all attached addendum, then any acceptance of the seller counter offer is not valid, right? So this is saying, hey, if I'm including like an addendum number 1 or a backup offer addendum or seller to remain in possession or seller's purchase of replacement property or a tenant occupied purchase addendum, right? Or residential lease after sale, seller intent to exchange or other, that not only do I have to actually include it with the counter offer, but it actually needs to be signed by the seller as well. So not only is my seller going to sign this counter offer, but they're also going to sign the SIP form as well that's included, right? So that's how that works. And that's what it means here. If I say, hey, we're including addendum number 1 and I send it over and it's not signed by the seller, then it's no longer valid. Okay. And the acceptance of the counter offer is not valid. Okay, same thing here, that it has to be signed by both parties. So if the buyer's accepting the counter offer, the buyer also has to sign that SIP form. They also have to sign the seller's purchase of replacement property or the addendum 1, right? So all parties have to sign both documents for them to be valid and for the acceptance of the counter offer to be valid. So keep that in mind if we're being lazy and we're like, oh, here, I'm getting close to my deadline, so let me send that counter offer back, but then we don't include the other documents. It's actually not even valid. So make sure you include those with it. Any questions so far about sections 1A through E?
No, ma'am.
All right, fabulous. Thank you. Expiration is section 2. The counter offer shall be deemed revoked and the deposits, if any, shall be returned unless by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after the date of the seller counter offer is signed in paragraph 4. If more than one signature, then by the last signature date, or by blank time on blank date. It is signed in paragraph 5 by the buyer, and a copy of the signed seller counter offer is delivered to seller or seller's authorized agent, right? So it defaults just like the residential purchase agreement to 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after the last seller signature on this form, or we can update it here by putting like 10 a.m. on a specific date. Just so you know, I'm not a fan of giving less than 24 hours to review a document. In fact, if somebody sends me over an offer or a counter offer with less than 24 hours, I get really annoyed. And it makes me not want to accept their offer or their counter offer, whatever they're sending me over. It just feels annoying to me that you would give me less than 24 hours unless we've already talked about it, right? So if we talked about, oh yeah, we can review that right away, we'll get back to you, it'd still give me 24 hours. That's just me though. So that's A, expiration. B is if seller withdraws the counter offer at any time prior to buyer's acceptance by communicating withdrawal to the buyer or buyer's agent, CAR form WOO may be used. Or if the seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance of this counter offer, right? So the seller's making an offer to the buyer. This is leaving the door open for other offers to come in and potentially the seller to make choices to go with another offer. So if the seller signs and agrees to another offer and signs that residential purchase agreement before the buyer sends this back, it's officially deemed withdrawn and revoked. You don't even technically have to verbally or do that on writing. It's just, hey, by the way, we got another offer in, the seller's decided to accept that other offer. You can't like sign this and send it over and be like, well, no, you countered us and you didn't withdraw it. No, it doesn't work that way. So just so you know, that's how the expiration works. Now, if you're a seller, a listing agent, right, and you've got a listing, you've got a seller counter offer out, you haven't received it back, you get a much better offer in, you guys decide to move forward with that other offer, I would actually go ahead and text that other agent and say, hey, just a heads up, we're withdrawing our seller counter offer. And then I would send them the WOO form just to make sure that, hey, all my I's are dotted and all my T's are crossed, right? I want to make sure that we protect and that we don't end up with a legal battle over who signed what at what time, because that's what it's going to come down to is what's that timestamp? When was it sent over electronically? So it could become actually a legal battle. So I would, if we get a better offer in, I would absolutely communicate to the other agent that we are withdrawing the seller counter offer. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about section 2? All right.
No,
moving
ma'am.
right. Oh, did you say no, ma'am?
I said no, ma'am.
Cool. Section 3, marketing to other buyers. The seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale. Seller has a right to accept another offer received prior to acceptance of this counter offer by buyer as specified in 2A and 5. In such event, seller is advised to withdraw the seller counter offer before accepting the other offer, right? So just like I just said, I would communicate to the other agent that we're withdrawing the offer, and then I would also follow up with the WOO form, right? But we can still, until we reach a solid agreement with any buyer, that property can remain as active on the MLS and be marketed as such. 4 is the offer. Seller makes this counter offer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making this counter offer. Any previous offer or counter offer can no longer be accepted. The terms and conditions of those documents are incorporated into the seller counter offer unless otherwise agreed. Okay, and then the seller signs there. So, right, if the seller makes an offer, a counter offer, and then comes back and makes seller counter offer number 2 without buyer responding to the original counter offer, the previous counter offer can't be accepted. It becomes void. Now, again, if I was doing that and making a second counter offer and changing the terms of the first counter offer, I would actually do a withdrawal of offer. So I withdraw seller counter offer number 1 and replace it with seller counter offer number 2, just because I want my I's to be dotted and my T's to be crossed. And I want there to be a paper trail outlining everything. So if I'm submitting that second counter offer, I'm going to do it with a withdrawal form. Okay. Section 5 is acceptance. I or we accept the seller counter offer if checked, subject to the attached buyer counter offer number, and acknowledge a receipt of a copy. So if we are going to counter this offer, we would sign the acceptance line and we would check this box here and fill out, buyer counter offer number 1. This box is so super important. If you're countering, the buyer is required to sign this because we're saying, hey, we agree to all this except for the things mentioned on this counter offer over here, right? We can't just make a counter offer without agreeing to their counter offer. So we want to sign it and agree to it subject to the attached buyer counter offer. Same thing with our RPA. The seller shouldn't be making a counter offer without agreeing to the residential purchase agreement. So there's also a box there on the acceptance line for the seller that they would say subject to, we're accepting this subject to the attached seller counter offer. And then again, it comes back up here to the top that, hey, we're agreeing to everything in that purchase agreement except for the items mentioned here. Okay, everything else is agreed to. Okay, and same thing when we make a buyer counter offer, we're saying, hey, we agree to everything in the purchase contract. We agree to everything in the seller counter offer except the following things. So you don't have to put in your counter offer all other terms are agreeable or right, anything like that. We understand that we're accepting all the terms that were made previous to this except for the ones identified here. Any additional questions on the seller counter offer? All right. There's a second form that we can use. So if the seller gets multiple offers in on the property and they want to counter multiple parties at the same time, then instead of the seller counter offer, they're going to use what's called a seller multiple counter offer. It's really important when a seller counters you that you look at the top of this form and that you make sure that you fully understand whether they have sent you a counter offer, and when your buyer agrees to it, you're officially in contract, or whether it's a seller multiple counter offer, which means that when my buyer signs it, we send it back to the seller, we're still not in contract. Seller still has to make the final determination of which multiple counter offer they're going to go with. So then we have the seller multiple counter offer form, the SMCO. This one operates at the top very much like a regular counter offer. It's basically the same. Okay. So we'd still put in seller counter offer number 1 here, right? Seller multiple counter offer here. And just so you know, a seller could, if we have a seller counter offer out, we get a second offer in that you're like, oh, this one's pretty good, but we'd like to counter that one. We can, on the withdrawal of offer form, you can actually withdraw the original counter offer and replace it with a multiple counter offer. So then you could counter both offers at the same time. But the top fills out just the same, right? It's to the purchase agreement, buyer counter offer other. We're going to put the date in here. You're going to put the full address, the date of the document being referenced, right? So if it was purchase agreement dated yesterday, you're going to put the buyer's names in here. This one doesn't automatically populate because again, it's set up that you could send out multiple buyer counter offers or seller multiple counter offers, and they would all have seller multiple counter offer number 1. Okay, so all your let's say you're sending out 3 multiple counter offers to 3 different buyers. They would all be seller multiple counter offer number 1, because in that transaction, it's the first multiple counter offer going out, even though you're sending out 3 of them. However, they're all going to have different buyers' names on them. So you're going to put, buyer 1 for the first one, and then on your second one, buyer 2. Then, you could go back in here and hit add. We're going to go forms library. We're going to look for the SMCO. We're going to hit add. Close. Okay, hold on. We're going to move this. Oh, it added some other forms for me. See if we can get this to move up. All right. So here's the second seller. This would still be seller multiple counter offer number 1. But instead of this would be 2 buyer 1 and 2 buyer 2, right? For the second offer that was received, we're going to counter that one and counter the original. So it would have those buyers' names on there. And you don't have to counter the same terms. Maciel, question?
Yeah, so then you technically could, it's the first seller counter offer number 1, but let's say you had 3 of them, like you said, you'd have to fill one out for each person then.
Yes.
Okay, even if it was the same. Okay, and like you said, you can have different terms for different people, because like I think on one of mine we had the same terms. There was 2 of us that were competing against it, and we had the same terms. And so I remember we were like, okay, let's ask them what if the term was the same for the other person, because if we're both accepting the same term, like we're in the same position again.
Yep. So your buyers still have the same option, right? So as Maciel mentioned, if you get a multiple counter offer, it's okay to contact the other agent and be like, hey, how many multiple counter offers did you send out? Oh, we sent out 2. Were the terms different or were they the same, right? It's okay to ask that, see how much information that they're willing to share with you. And they'd be like, oh, the terms were exactly the same, right? And then your buyer has an option, even on a multiple counter offer, they can accept it as it's written. They can decide they don't want to move forward. They don't even have to reject it. They can just not return that multiple counter offer. Although again, it comes down to etiquette. And I think it's always good etiquette to respond back to the other agent and just go, hey, just so you know, my buyers have decided not to move forward. We're not going to counter you. We just aren't moving forward, right? Just so they know not to expect or be waiting for anything back. Or your buyers can counter a multiple counter offer, totally appropriate that they can respond with a counter offer. And they may even be like, oh, well, if they countered me on these terms, and I know like Maciel said that like, hey, we got a multiple counter offer and the terms were the same on both. We need to step our game up just a little bit and make some of the terms a little bit better, add $1,000 to that purchase price, remove a contingency, shorten a contingency period, increase our deposit. Anastasia and I were talking yesterday. They had an offer. She had an offer out, and then her buyers decided that they were going to put some more money down. And she goes, do I have to change it? And I go, well, if you're not in a multiple offer situation, you could always just leave it. And then that way, if the seller counters you, you could counter back with, hey, we're going to put more down, right? To make your offer stronger. So you could utilize that as a negotiating fact. So there's lots of options there. So your buyers can absolutely counter a multiple counter offer as well.
What if, I've called agents before where I've asked them if their listing is still active, and they're like, we're at a multiple counter, like I'm just going to send out multiple counter offer now, but they're like, but if you can go ahead and submit, you can still submit something. So like, is that even like, can you do that still? Like,
yeah,
like
absolutely.
How does that work?
So,
you know what I mean? Like you send out a multiple counter offer so people can respond back, but then you're waiting for somebody else's offer to come in that just barely saw your listing.
absolutely. So, strategy wise, as a listing agent, if I've got multiple offers in hand and I'm going to be countering one of those offers, because they are like there's a solid standout. I might go ahead and counter both with a seller multiple counter offer, so that if another offer came in the meantime, I reserve the right to, like, even if they return it, I could still go with the other counter or with the other offer.
Got
I
it.
know
Okay.
it's shady, but that's how life rolls. Life is
So-
shady sometimes.
I had one, and I received the multiple counter offer back along with the other person's RPA,
Yeah.
which was significantly less than what our offer was.
Yeah.
And they were asking us to go higher. But I didn't say anything that I had that she had sent me. And then she was like, "Oh, just disregard it." And I'm like, "I've already seen it, lady. How am I going to disregard it?" And then you're going to say it's a multiple counter and you want me to go higher when your other offer is way lower?
Yeah, because technically, you shouldn't have seen it, and she did have multiple offers, so you can use that towards your advantage. So, hey, you might do that in the future too. Learn from it.
So that's the strategy, right? And she screwed up on it because you saw her bluff, but she was trying to get you to go up. And so, you don't have to agree to their terms. We can counter them. And when put in a position like that, it's always good to say, "Hey, how many counter offers did you send out?" She's like, 2. Then you'd be like, "Oh, are they the same or different?" And she's like, "Oh, they're different." Then she's probably not asking them to come up as high as she's asking you to come up. So try to glean as much information as possible from that, with that error, and make sure that you don't ever send somebody else's purchase agreement out with a counter offer to the wrong participant. Don't show your hand, right?
Dumb.
So the rest of this counter offer on the top, section 1 here, A through E, is the same as the regular counter offer. It's just multiple counter offer. Section 2 is different. This was the expiration on the counter offer. This is the binding effect on the multiple counter offer. So seller is making a multiple counter offers to other prospective buyers on terms that may or may not be the same as in this multiple counter offer. This multiple counter offer does not bind the seller and buyer unless all the following occur in the time specified below. Seller signs in paragraph 5, buyer signs in paragraph 7, seller signs in paragraph 8, and buyer receives a copy of the multiple counter offer with all of the signatures. Note, prior to completion of all foregoing, buyer and seller shall have no duties or obligations for the purchase or sale of the property, right? Until all those things occur. That is what creates the binding effect. Section 3 is the same as the regular counter offer. The expiration of the multiple counter offer, it expires on 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after the date that the seller signed, or we can change that expiration date. And then let's see here, marketing to other buyers. We have the right, like Maciel was asking, we have the right to continue to offer the property for sale and the right to accept any other offer received prior to the seller's selection of this multiple counter offer. The seller makes this multiple counter offer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy. By making this counter offer, any provisions, previous offer or counter offer can no longer be accepted. The terms and conditions of those documents incorporated into the seller multiple counter offer unless otherwise agreed. And then seller signs. So this is that first signature box mentioned in number 2, is the seller actually has to sign the counter offer that they're making the multiple counter offer. Okay. Again, section 6 is where it's going to change up a little bit. Seller acceptance of the multiple, or acceptance of seller multiple counter offer. Buyer's acceptance of the seller multiple counter offer shall be deemed revoked, and the deposit, if any, shall be returned to buyer unless by 5 p.m. on the 4th day after the seller signs in paragraph 5, if more than one seller, then the last date, or by blank date at blank time. It is signed in paragraph 8 by the seller, and a copy of the seller multiple counter offer signed by the seller in paragraph 8 is also personally received by the buyer or the buyer's agent who's authorized to receive it. So what's that saying? That is saying that, hey, if my buyers agree to this multiple counter offer, they sign it, they return it to the seller. The seller then has a total of 4 days from the date that they originally signed. So when the date that they signed in 5, they have up to 4 days by 5 p.m. to return this sign back to the buyer to create a binding agreement. Okay, so if my seller signed this on and sent it over, and then my buyers, let's say the seller sent it over to the buyers yesterday, the buyers sign and accept it today, my sellers have a couple more days before they actually have to respond and pick a final counter offer. Okay.
So if they received another offer because somebody viewed their property and they still have not signed this within the 4th day, they can technically go accept the other offer and not sign this and not be in contract with them.
Yep, or they could
4
delay
days.
and let it drag out there to day 4, and then they end up not getting an offer from those people that saw their property. They can then sign this one, send it over, and be done. Well, we're in contract.
Gotcha.
Yep. Okay. Unless we change it, right? So unless the buyer down here, they can change that date and time. So if they're like, hey, we don't want to give them 4 days, right? Because it defaults to 4. So even if the seller gave me a different expiration date here, maybe the seller said, hey, within 24 hours. So they made the offer yesterday. They said that, hey, it needs to be returned today by 6 p.m. Well, let's go 5 p.m., right? This still defaults down here to the acceptance that it shall be deemed revoked if the not returned to the buyer by 5 p.m. on the 4th day after the seller signs. So even though the seller is expecting a response in 24 hours, they still have another 3 days to review my response before making an offer. So we may come back and be like, hey, you've got until tomorrow at 5 p.m., right? So you may want to change that up to keep it in line with whatever the time is that the seller gave you to respond. I'd give the seller the same amount of time to respond, unless it's longer. Okay. And remember, not only does the seller have to sign it, so that's where the buyer would sign down here. Not only would the buyer have to sign this and send it back to the seller, but the seller actually has to sign that they're accepting it and send it back to the buyer for it to be valid. Seller signs paragraph 5. The expiration on 3 is for the seller. Section 6, this expiration is for the buyer's signature on 7. It's how long the buyers are giving the sellers to make their final determination of which offer they're going to move forward with. Buyer accepts the above multiple counter offer. If checked, subject to the attached counter offer number 1 and acknowledges the receipt and copy, right? So if we're going to counter, we're going to check this box and put, oh, it's going to be subject to buyer counter offer number 1. Then we're going to put our buyer's names here, and then we're going to sign it. Okay, and that's all that's going to happen there. So seller signs it, sends it to us. Buyer makes a response of either accepting, they decide not to respond at all, or we're going to counter it, at which point we check this box, and then buyer signs 7. We send it back to the sellers. Then we have section 8. This is the seller's response to our buyer's response. And this is only valid if we aren't putting a counter offer in place. If the buyer makes a counter offer, now box 8 doesn't matter anymore. It's just avoided. Nobody signs box 8. They're going to deal with whether they accept it or not on the buyer counter offer. Okay, but if we're accepting the seller multiple counter offer as is, we don't check this box. We don't fill out this number here. We just sign it saying, hey, we accept it. Whatever the seller's countering, we're ready to move forward with that. Then the seller has to respond in this box, or should respond, right? So selection of accepted multiple counter offer. Note to seller, do not sign this box until after the buyer signs in paragraph 7. Do not sign this box if this seller multiple counter offer is subject to an attached counter offer. Then we have seller accepts this multiple counter offer is the default. Seller would sign here. We'd send it back to the buyer. Or you might decide to accept the counter offer in backup position, right? We've got 2 offers in place. I'm going to hold buyer to this and lock them up in that backup position. Then you would check this box here. Seller accepts the multiple counter offer in backup position number 1. You might send this back to 3 different counter offers and put them in, position 1, 2, and 3. The backup offer addendum car form BUO dated blank is attached. It's probably going to be dated today. So that's the backup offer addendum is attached, and then seller would sign here. So either seller's going to sign A if they're accepting it. If they're putting it in backup position, they're going to sign B. And if they put it in backup position, now we have a new expiration date. I think this is our only form that has like 3 potential expiration dates on it. The seller multiple counter offer in backup position shall be deemed revoked, and the deposits shall be returned to the buyer unless by 5 p.m. on the 3rd day after the date seller signed in paragraph 8B, more than one seller than the last date, or by blank date at blank time. This seller multiple counter offer in backup position is signed by the buyer below, and the attached BUO is signed by the buyer, and copies of both are personally received by the seller or seller's authorized agent. So that's the box where the seller gets to make choices. The seller could, let's say that one buyer countered better terms. The seller could accept the buyer counter offer and then come back to the other multiple counter offer and accept that in backup position number 1. Maciel, question?
What if you wanted to counter the best buyer counter offer and then still have a backup?
And then still have a backup.
Could you do that or no?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the buyer made a counter offer, the seller could counter the buyer's counter offer, and the seller could still accept the second multiple counter offer or multiple counter offer in backup position. Yep.
So then if the seller countered the buyer's counter offer, wait, this is so tricky. If the sellers wanted to counter the buyer's counter offer, it wouldn't be this part of the form. It would be, it
would be a response to the buyer's counter offer.
It would be another form.
Yeah, on the other form.
But then this one, you can send this one out to a backup.
Yep.
Okay. Because then, like, what if you pissed off the first one that you countered again, and they're like, "Nope, we're withdrawing our offer," and now you've got your backup position 1. Yep. Yeah.
And just so you guys know too, putting an offer officially in backup position is a strategy thing. So oftentimes, like if you're in a hot market, you got multiple offers coming back in, your first weekend on the market and you've got multiple offers, and that if you put this property back on the market again, it's probably going to get the same multiple offers. It may not be in your best interest to put an offer in backup position. However, if you're like, if the seller's purchasing a replacement property and the purchase of that property is contingent on the sale of their property, then you may absolutely want to lock in that backup offer to show the seller of the other property that your seller is in contract to buy that, hey, not only do we have an offer, but we've got a backup offer in place. Like if something falls through, we are solid, right? So strategy wise, that might be in a good position. Or in a market that's a little slower, the property sits on the market a couple weeks, you end up with multiple offers coming in one weekend, you may be like, hey, we're going to lock this down, because if I have to go back on the market, it may sit for another couple of weeks. We may end up having to go for a price reduction, or something might happen in order to get this property moved again. Who knows what's going to happen? It may be in your best interest to lock in that backup offer as well. So just know there's some strategy there as to whether it makes sense to put an offer officially in backup or whether it makes sense not to. And just to let them know that you'll let them know if anything goes awry with the accepted offer. So there's some strategy associated with that backup offer addendum. Any other questions about the seller counter offer or the seller multiple counter offer?
Do you have to do the multiple counter, or can you just do a counter?
You can just do a counter. So if you are only countering one of your multiple offers, maybe you're cleaning up some terms, maybe you've already had a conversation with the agent, what their buyers are willing to accept, you can absolutely just send out a regular counter offer to one potential buyer.
Okay.
Yep. All right, and that brings us into our buyer counter offer form would be the next one. So we covered the SCO. the SMCO, I really thought like, gosh, I'm just covering the counter offers. How long can this really take? And here we are at 9:50. So we have the buyer counter offer, right? So buyer makes an offer, seller makes a counter offer either on the SCO form or the SMCO form. And now the buyer is going to counter that counter offer. So it would be buyer counter offer number one. Even though there's a seller counter offer, the buyer counter offer stands on its own. So it'd be BCO number one would be the first one. You're going to put the date that you prepare it. And this is either going to be a counter offer to the seller counter offer number one. Whoops, I clicked on the wrong line. Or it's to the seller multiple counter offer number one, right? Or it's to other. So for the most part, it's either going to be in reference to the counter offer or the multiple counter offer. And then you're going to put the date of that counter offer. So remember, all of our counter offers have had a date printed in the upper right-hand corner of the counter offer form, and that's the date that you're going to put in this line. On the property known as, put the full address in there. We lost Adriana. Put the buyer's names and the seller's names, and those are going to be referred to as parties. The terms and conditions of the above referenced document are acceptable subject to the following, right? So we're saying, hey, the seller counteroffer was acceptable, was referencing the residential purchase agreement subject to the following items. And now the buyer counteroffer is subject to the seller counteroffer except for the following items, right? So we're saying, hey, we agree to everything that was already agreed to. Plus we agree to everything we're not mentioning here on this form. Liquidated damage and arbitration of disputes in the offer each require initials by parties. If either of those parties is not initialed by all parties, that paragraph is excluded from the final agreement unless specifically referenced for inclusion in paragraph 1D of this or another counter offer or addendum. Just so you know here, this is saying, hey, if it's not initialed by, if the liquidated damage and the arbitration isn't initialed by both parties, it's not valid. For the most part, for compliance, we want it in writing that either all parties are agreeable to not agreeing to that or all parties agree to that. Because if one person is initialing that they agree to it and the other person doesn't initial, then most of the time for compliance purposes, they're going to say the contract is invalid, that it's not valid because we don't have full agreement on all terms of the contract. So you want it in writing, whether we're agreeing or not agreeing to those paragraphs. If there's only one on the original RPA. Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counter offer, down payment and loan amounts will be adjusted in the same proportion as the original offer, but the dollar amount of any initial and increased deposit and seller credit shall remain unchanged from the original offer. So same as the seller multiple or seller counter offer. Unless otherwise agreed or altered in another counter offer, if the original offer, such as paragraph 3L2, the RPA, the appraisal contingency, right? Same thing as in the seller counter offer. That keeps the same dollar amount difference. It adjusts with the purchase price, but same dollar amount difference for that appraisal guarantee or that appraisal gap. D is where you're going to put in other terms. So here's where you're actually going to write in what you're countering: price, contingencies, contingent on the sale, or the buyer would be contingent on the sale of buyer's property. Whatever it might be that you're countering is going to go on these lines here, section D. Again, same thing here. I like to fill it out and put what I'm referencing. Am I referencing the residential purchase agreement? Am I, referencing the seller counter offer, item 1D? And then did they label it right? One, right? So what are we referencing? I like to be very specific and then, put in whatever it is that you're countering there. So there's never any questions about what it is that's being countered. The following, so that's section D, and then E is the following addendum are incorporated into this buyer counter offer only when signed by both parties. If both parties do not sign and deliver all attached addenda, then the acceptance of this buyer counter offer is not valid. So this would be addendum or any other forms. Maybe you're including in your buyer counter offer the septic and well and property monument addendum, right? So you could put that in here. Maybe you're asking the seller to pay for the septic inspection. So you could put it in there, the addendums. So whatever you're going to attach, put it in there. It has to be signed by the buyer at the time they sign this buyer counter offer. And then when the seller accepts it, if they do, the seller also has to sign those forms in order for the acceptance to be valid. Same thing with that seller counter offer or the seller multiple counter offer. Any questions so far on this buyer counteroffer? It's basically the same as the seller counteroffer up to this point, except it just says buyer counteroffer at the top. Expiration, same as the other one. The buyer counteroffer shall be deemed revoked and deposits, if any, shall be returned unless by 5 p.m. on the third day after the date this buyer counteroffer is signed in paragraph 3. If more than one signature, then the last signature date, or by blank date at blank time. So default is 3 days at 5 p.m., or you can change that. It is signed in paragraph 4 by the seller, and a copy of the signed buyer counteroffer is delivered to buyer or buyer's authorized agent. Or if buyer withdraws this buyer counteroffer anytime prior to seller's acceptance by communicating withdrawal or seller or to seller or seller's agents, CAR form WOO may be used. Just so you know, the WOO form keeps saying may be used to withdraw, because technically you don't have to do it in an official CAR form. You could call the other agent and say, hey, we're withdrawing our offer. The problem with calling an agent and telling them that is that there's no record that you withdrew the offer. So now you're going to go into a legal battle over whether it was withdrawn or not withdrawn. So your best bet is to shoot them over, maybe call them, follow up with a text message and say, hey, just confirm we're withdrawing our offer. I'm going to send you over a WOO form. I always recommend sending over that WOO form because that's the official notification that, hey, on this date at this time, I notified you via phone or text that we're withdrawing our offer. This is the official withdrawal. And then your buyer signs it, you send it over, right? So I always recommend using the WOO form, but you should always notify them. Either by the phone. Phone is usually best because that's, it's like a verbal, like it's just an etiquette thing. It comes down to etiquette. Like pick up the phone and have the decency to call somebody if you're withdrawing the offer. And then I would follow up with a text message after I got off the phone with them. Or if I didn't reach them, then I would leave them a message and follow up with a text message still. Okay. Offer. Buyer makes this counter offer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt by making this counter offer, any previous offer or counter offer can no longer be accepted, which means, right? So this means that, hey, we can't like accept the seller's counter offer now, but you could withdraw this potentially and then accept it. But you always run it by the other agent first. This form, we fill it out, buyer signs there, then we're going to send it over to the seller. The seller has the same options as the buyer had with the counter offer. They either accept the buyer counter offer and will sign addendum, if any, and or it's subject to the attached seller counter offer. This would probably be a seller counter offer number 2. Or seller multiple counter offer number 2, right? So if we have multiple counter offers out, the seller can always respond with another multiple counter offer. So there's lots of options there for that, and acknowledge receipt of a copy. Ta-da! So that's your buyer counter offer. Any questions on the buyer counter offer?
Not for me.
Fabulous. So that covers our seller counter offer, our seller multiple counter offer, and our buyer counter offer. Any other questions before we finish up for today?
My offer didn't get accepted.
What?
My offer did not get accepted.
Oh, that's so sad.
Oh, we went up against 22 people.
22 people?
22. They had 22 offers. I think
Oh
they
my-
purposely bid it low to get a bidding war going.
That's really common in the Bay Area.
So
The
even the lender, he was like, that is very low for that area.
Yeah. The Bay Area used to be really popular with doing the auctions. So we had this whole period where we were running auctions on properties, and it just never took off in like the Solano County area. We couldn't get agents on board. I actually really liked the auction. You put the property on the market, the potential buyers, number one, they had to be represented by an agent, which was good. And then number 2, oftentimes you added the premium to the purchase price so that the buyer was actually paying for their own commission, which was kind of nice. And then it allowed full disclosure. Like a buyer could log on and see exactly where that price was at any given time. Like, oh, I can see this. And then they can decide they want to bid more. or less, or then stop, right? And then if the buyer came in, it's not like eBay at the last minute, the buyer could come in and make an offer, and then the auction would actually stay open like an extra 15 minutes to give everybody else the same opportunity to increase their offer. So you could actually drag it on for a while after the official close of auction date or time. But it allowed for full disclosure of where the purchase price was at. You didn't get to see terms, but you could at least see the price. So you knew whether you were going to be competitive or not. Never took off in Solano County. Couldn't get agents on board with it at all. They were like, I don't like this. We're telling people what the offers are that we have in hand. I think that's shady. I was like, it says you can in the listing agreement. But in the Bay Area, they used to run them all the time. They used to be super successful. What happens with the auctions, people get excited about it. And oftentimes it drives a property higher, especially in the Bay Area. It would drive that property higher than what it would have gotten just put on the market, even at a lower price, because people can see, they can be like, oh, well, I just have to be at, 800,000 in order to get this one. I was going to come in at 795, but I'll go in at 800. So it helped to drive the price up for the sellers.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And then it's like, how are you going to have your resale? When you go to turn around and sell it, you're not going to get what you just paid for it unless you do the same thing.
Most people, I mean, it wouldn't drive it substantially higher. I mean, you still had appraisals in place, so they still had contingencies and appraisals and all that stuff. It wasn't like courthouse auction. So, it still had to do all that, but oftentimes because you could show proof that, hey, we had 17 offers and here's where they were all at. They were all at or above asking, and this is what drove the price to this. Most of the time those properties appraised because you had the justification to back up that is what the market value of the property was.
That's crazy.
Anyways, make sure you log your attendance. It's in the chat box. And next week, we have open Q&A on Tuesday. So I may leave it open Q&A. I may put a topic in there. We'll see, but we'll leave it as that. Wednesday's supposed to be scripts again, so I may tweak that one a little bit. And then our car forms, because we're at the end of the month, I need to finalize my new schedule. Oh, Thursday's going to be canceled. No, it will be. It will be open forum for car. I don't have to leave until 10. So I will still host the training next Thursday. It'll be open forum. So next week's kind of just like hey, bring your topics. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to pick my brain on? What do you want to hear what everybody else has to say type week? So open Q&A on Tuesday at 3. We have scripts, although I may tweak it a little bit. I think there was a couple that I skipped, so I may come back and bring some content in there. And then on Thursday, it's open Q&A as well. And then we'll be putting out the new schedule. So make sure you log your attendance and make any suggestions for trainings that you would like to see for September, October, November. I think we're going to keep the same schedule though. Although Tuesday, how does everybody feel since you guys are on the call today? How do you feel about the Tuesday 3 o'clock training?
Sometimes I forget because it's in midday. If I'm running errands, I totally forget and I'm like, shoot, and then I always miss them.
Would you rather it be in the morning?
I like them in the morning because I know exactly what I have for the day. I mean, that's just me.
Well, I don't feel like I put it in the afternoon so that people maybe that couldn't make the morning could attend in the afternoon, but I don't have different people on there. I don't feel like on Tuesdays that I can't attend the morning. So I'm thinking about shifting it to the morning. I think it'd be easier for me too.
I also have a question about for the training classes we like to see. So I don't know how you want me to write this on the attendance. But like, let's say we did get multiple offers and you want to review them and then go over them with your sellers. Is there a form that you use or like a spreadsheet or something that you put everything on there? And I think one time I saw Ashley Phelps like post about it one time that she had one that you can use, but like a form like that we could go over so that when you're presenting to your sellers, you have it all clean and it's easy to explain. Absolutely.
Just put on the attendance form on the suggestions, just put multiple offer review.
Okay. I wrote how to review multiple offers on one form. Okay. Multiple offers.
I'll know what you're talking about. Cool. And then Marcial, are you going to be on next week on Tuesday at 3 for the open Q&A?
Or I can be.
Wednesday at 9.
He said Wednesday at 9. Yeah. That works.
All right, maybe
Wednesday at
we'll
9.
cover that next Wednesday.
Okay. Because I feel like the mornings are easier for me because I remember. Otherwise, I have so many alarms set that I forget to set the alarm for the afternoon, and that's when I'm running all my errands after
right.
school pickups.
Hey, Abby, since you're listening, can you update on our Tuesday training? Instead of scripts on Tuesday, we're gonna do multiple offer, how to review multiple offers with your sellers. Or maybe how about review and evaluate multiple offers. I like that. Review
Yeah,
and
me too.
on Tuesday at 9. No, Wednesday at 9. Wednesday at 9. Cool.
Wednesday, 9 a.m. Okay.
Wednesday, 9 a.m. Fabulous. If anybody needs anything, holler at me. Otherwise, have a fabulous weekend, and I will see you next week.
Have a great weekend. Community garage sale. Let's do it. Bye.
All right.